Panel, I would tell you that the value of art is not simply to have something beautiful to hang on your walls. It is not simply to have something that like critics in France can critique. It is not simply to have something that you can consume and that you can feel is for your own aesthetic pleasure. But in fact, many artists create from a sense of very deep emotional turmoil. Many artists create from their own political strife, and many artists create to express and galvanize movements. I think that is something that we are very proud to stand for on our side of the house. We would tell you that this case is not about the art that can necessarily balance aestheticism and political movements. We think that there is plenty of art that manages to be both aesthetically pleasing to the majority of people and also manages to be politically relevant and politically important. Rather, this motion is specifically speaking about art that necessarily needs to make a trade-off between aesthetic value and between political importance. I'm going to quickly define aesthetic value before moving into 3 points of construction. First, I want to say that aesthetic value, as we define it as government, is things that are generally understood to be aesthetically pleasing and artistically beautiful, but also generally evoke a sense of pleasure in the viewing experience. So it is something that can necessarily be critiqued by artistic, could necessarily be considered pleasurable to look at aesthetically, whatever that may be up to interpretation. If there's any clarifications, I'd be happy to take one. 3 points of extension. First, 3 points of construction. First, I want to talk about the innate value of art that makes viewers uncomfortable. I think that there is something inherently powerful about grotesque imagery that is necessarily not beautiful, that is necessarily something that is going to make you react poorly, either based on the fact that it is simply guttural in its reaction, or because it necessarily defies the conventional understandings of what it means to be art. In fact, I would tell you that oftentimes making art in this way is a political statement in and of itself, because it is intended to make the viewer uncomfortable. I think that then it is a political message, it is a political statement for the artist to make the viewer uncomfortable with these feelings. I would also tell you that oftentimes, if this art is specifically created to critique members of the dominant society, that is often where that sense of discomfort comes from, and that sense of discomfort is often necessary for the political statement to be made. I think about, when we talk about this, I can think about a lot of images, for instance, that depict horrendous things that have been done in within slavery, where it's necessarily grotesque, necessarily oftentimes intentionally unappealing to the eye, because it is intended to evoke a sense of discomfort within the viewer. Second, I think then that there's also other ways that art can necessarily be considered unesthetically pleasing other than being grotesque. And I think that that's when art is necessarily unesthetically considered unartistic, because it chooses to reject the common forms of what it means to be aesthetically pleasing within art. I think that that sometimes means things that are incredibly literal, right? Things that are do not adhere to what we consider beautiful art to be. Maybe it's not beautiful expressionism. Maybe it includes block text that is very, very clear in its meaning. I think that this is also incredibly important to consider under the frame of this motion. Contrast, say, a beautiful expression of a beautiful I'm trying to an abstract painting that the artist intended to speak about the struggle of protesters fighting against police brutality within the United States, versus say a protest poster that says "Stop killing us," that is not necessarily beautiful, it is not necessarily aesthetically pleasing, but it gets the point across. Why do I think that it's important to necessarily value art that is politically expedient in getting its point across, as opposed to something that is less liberal, but less literal, but probably more artistically valued and necessarily more aesthetically valued? Because I think that if your intention of creating your art is to galvanize people within your own communities, to galvanize people to listen, or if it is simply to speak to a members of your community that are not traditionally part of artistic communities in the way that we would necessarily consider to be classic artistic communities, then it is not within the interest of your artistic medium or your artistic expression to then cater your aestheticism to people that only like to hear about black art when it's Basquiat in a museum, right? I think that if you are trying to necessarily target people and necessarily galvanize them, then you want to be literal and you don't want to leave things up to interpretation, because once your art is left up to interpretation, once it is left up to critique, it can be misinterpreted, it can become misinformed, and it can become warped and utilized in incorrect ways. I would would tell you then that it is necessary within these instances for artists to value the political importance of their art over its aestheticism. Lastly, I would say that aestheticism is largely based on context. What do I mean by this? That what is beautiful and what is considered artistically prudent is oftentimes based on the context of like class, and oftentimes based on the context of like the specific part of the world you are in, and also based on the dominant cultural narratives within that culture. Why do I think that this is incredibly important? Because I think it means that it can also be incredibly prudent for our member. Before I go into that here, I'm going to finish my sentence and then I'll take our opening. I think it is incredibly important for a member of that group to opt into choosing an unaesthetically pleasing form of art as a form of protest against the artistic movement and against the dominant cultural narratives that they have found themselves in. I think that, for example, we can use a lot of indigenous art that is necessarily not considered beautiful or aesthetically pleasing to the viewing of like a North American class, but to choose an unaesthetically pleasing form of art and to choose an unaesthetically a pleasing form of expression is a political statement in and of itself, and is necessary for that political statement to come across, because to choose any other form would necessarily to betray the message. Go ahead, opening.
The motion doesn't say this house would prefer political impact over things that are aesthetically pleasing to the majority. You also have to defend people just making things non-aesthetically pleasing, even if it's aesthetically pleasing from their own community.
Yeah, I feel like I've spoken very largely to grotesque images in my first and second points, and that grotesque images are going to be grotesque no matter what. I personally do not like imagery of like, say, someone with like lashes against their back and I am black. I don't think that that is necessary. Like, I think an image can be grotesque because it is grotesque, and that is the point. I've already been analyzing this in my first 2 points. I'm simply analyzing different ways that things can be unappealing aesthetically, which brings me to my last point. I think it is a political choice to oftentimes opt into not making aesthetic choices. That in of itself is this the politicization, and they are going to need to defend a world in which people have to opt into aesthetic choices and then therefore betray the messaging that they are trying to get through their art and betray their movements. Very proud to propose.
I thank that member for their speech, and I invite the Leader of Opposition to open up the opposition bench. Hear, hear.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about three arguments. First of all, I'm going to talk about why it is that this actively hampers the ability for artists to get representation. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why the very goal of opening government, of getting more political discourse, is hampered by this motion. And finally, I'm going to talk about the inherent value of aesthetic art and why it is that on their side, they solidify a form of aestheticism, if that's a word, that is predominantly Eurocentric. Before that, a little bit of framing that I think largely does take out OG in the debate. Everything else I'm going to put inside my constructive. Three things to note. First of all, on our side, we support a balance as to whether or not you use political or non-political art. Very similar to the status quo. The defense that opening government has, the word they have to defend, is one in which most artists predominantly prioritize political art instead. The importance of this is that different artists have different conceptions of what is political and what is aesthetic. So it is a lie to assume that we have to defend a world in which indigenous artists create aesthetic art, but it isn't aesthetic to the majority, therefore they should not produce it, and therefore it's political. That is a complete lie. The second thing, though, is that our burden is to prove to you that it is a worse world if most of this art is political. The importance of this, though, is that on government, they cannot tell you that grotesque art is good, and the motion is not this house would embrace unpalatable or grotesque art. That is not it at all. Rather, they have to identify why a shift from artists entirely moving away from like the mix of aesthetic and grotesque and political to entirely political is the best option forward. They have not met that in this debate. All they have said is they will embrace political art, which we can on our side as well. There is no analysis of the trade-off that has come from opening government so far. First argument then, why it actively hurts artists and in turn hurts representation. The first and key part of this is to understand that what happens now is that art becomes restricted to the political beliefs of the consumer. I want you to consider the ways in which news companies currently operate in the status quo, where Fox News is constantly consumed by conservatives and other things are constantly consumed by liberals. The exact same thing here is likely to happen towards artists. In a world in which art is largely seen as non-political, but there are some political pieces of art, I think that is significantly less likely. However, two important impacts of this. Number one, I think it actively just makes artists poorer, right? Because you cut out an entire 50% of the consumer base when it is this artist is seen as predominantly liberal or predominantly conservative. And it raises barriers as a consequence to being able to access this art in the very first place, to go to art school, to make money as an artist, meaning that representation amongst poor artists is likely to become lower as well. Secondly, though, I think it also decreases the representation and the exact same political messages that you talk about. Because if I go to a museum right now with no understanding of the political biases of the museum, and I'm a moderate individual, one political piece of art might stand out to me and might make changes. When it is seen as one specific artist is always liberal, it becomes less likely that I consume any of their art at all. Secondly, though, I think this creates a cultural shift in which we essentialize people, where even when individuals want to make art that isn't necessarily political, it is always seen as political. So for example, it looks like someone that is indigenous trying to make art about that just celebrates a section of their culture, but instead it is seen and critiqued by the art critiques as something that is definitely politicized and definitely about residential schools. Third of all, though, and this one's very important, this leads to the whitewashing of political art. Why is that? Because right now in the status quo, white people focus on aesthetics because, let's be honest, they don't have that many struggles in their lives. That's why it is that predominantly white musicians do things such as make love songs while black artists genuinely talk about things like Black Lives Matter. What happens when white people don't have struggles in their lives? They create struggles. There are two possible impacts of that. Number one, they pick a political impact that is actively contrary to the political impact that minority artists is actively attempting to do. Secondly, though, so that looks like things such as them doing things such as creating white nationalist art potentially. Secondly, though, I think it looks like things such as in the absence of this, they attempt to co-opt the causes and struggles of other minority groups in order to understand and in order to get the same consumer base. And they're likely to co-opt this because they oftentimes have more funding, they oftentimes have more things such as the ability to get contracts in museums, and because they're oftentimes more privileged, meaning that they are more able to access these opportunities. Why is it on our side this co-opting is unlikely to happen? Because the competition is in different realms. When black artists make a piece about things like Black Lives Matter, the different realm is that a white artist knows that they should probably stay away from that and knows that they are likely to do something such as instead make another love song. The difference is on your side. When all art has to be political, people start talking about the politics of other people they do not understand. It becomes more of a competitive realm in which individuals that are already privileged already becomes advantage. Second argument then, why it harms a political discourse. The first thing I've already identified, which is that it vastly whitewashes this political discourse. But the second thing, and this is incredibly important, is that it desensitizes political discourse, because the grotesque art that Hart talks about is good because it is unique. It is different. It makes someone feel something that is different from everything else they felt when they looked at the art before. When that becomes the commonplace art, it is no longer a powerful and unique message. It is the same message as everybody else. In that instance, then, there's no more ability for individuals to stand out and have the unique political messages that are necessary. Finally, then, on aesthetic value. I think right now, oh, sorry, go ahead, OG.
Chris, could you explain to me if there are more people, number one, making explicit political art? And I would also say that most art is political, whether or not it's explicitly so. Then why is it bad now that we are going to have more people being able to show different opinions? Because guess what? They're not shocking anymore because they're not the only black artists talking about Black Lives Matter. So
number one, because of the fact that the political messaging gets co-opted. And number two, I'm going to explain this right now, why there is a certain aesthetic value that is important. On your side, aesthetic value remains and stays static. It stays what it has been in the past, which has largely been things such as Eurocentric art and Eurocentric art schools. However, we change the broad impact of it as art from other cultures become more and more normalized. It is normalized because more people start to create it and more people start to consume it. And importantly, there is a trade-off here, because the more political art that you make, the more it is seen that other cultures' art is simply only about politics and doesn't have inherent value by itself, that there's nothing beautiful in those other cultures by themselves, and there's stories that are not worth being told because it entirely has to be one that is political. There's a hegemony of white Eurocentric dominated art on aesthetic values right now. We want to break down that hegemony. There's an inherent benefit to aesthetic value, but even more on OG's own metric, we win this debate. Very proud to stand on opening law.
I thank that member for their speech, and I invite the Deputy Prime Minister to close off opening government. Hear, hear.
Everyone can hear me? Yeah? Okay. The previous speech was quite confusing for me because at the end of it, I'm truly unsure as to where opening opposition actually stands. I feel like they tried to claim literally every form of art that they could conceive a value for without ever engaging with the trade-offs that Hart tried to model this debate over. I'm going to try and clarify what I think this debate is, but I really am going to try my best not to get sucked into this because I know this is going to be a weird front-half definition debate, and I think there are actually valuable things to discuss here. So, on OO's weird quibbling about what aesthetic means, when they say that when Hart said we need to discuss trade-offs, specifically where artists are actually having to consider whether or not they want to be more literal or more grotesque, therefore sacrificing aesthetic value, or be more political, those are specifically the trade-offs that we're talking about. Quite explicitly, Hart also said that we are likely to still have a lot of aesthetic art and a lot of political art in either side of this debate. It is specifically when artists have to make a decision because their different concepts of art have to make that trade-off. It is that trade-off and that individual artist decision that we are discussing here. That means that it was really confusing for Chris to come up here and say, OG has to stand behind 100% political art and zero aestheticism. We are talking about where decisions have to be made in terms of these trade-offs. But secondly, they try and claim that grotesque art and minority aesthetic art is still part of their mandate because they don't have to stand behind specifically mainstream aestheticism. They just need to stand behind some aestheticism. I would ask you to reflect on what on earth this means if we can just define aestheticism as to whatever we personally consider to be aesthetic, because an aesthetic value has literally no definition. Obviously, it has to somewhat pander to some kind of mainstream or majority, because that's the only way that aesthetic value is determined. Aesthetic value that is literally determined by the individual in and of itself is literally nothing, and therefore opening opposition has to discuss some kind of mainstreamism. Notably, something that they also seem to get behind when they talk about getting into museums, because if they want to say, hey, minorities can define aesthetics however they please, but also you have to get into like the Museum of Modern Art, like obviously you are pandering to a mainstream, so I'm still just like truly confused as to what opposition actually stands for. I hope DJ clears it up, but like honestly, I don't know how we're going to respond to it. Okay, first on explicit clash. They tell you about financial resources. They say getting into things like museums and getting that representation is important for the artists. One, this again relies on appealing to a dominant class. If they want to talk about artists making more money, that is very specifically that you have to say, oh, like Black musicians need to cater to their white audiences. Like Indigenous artists need to make sure that white people can appreciate their aesthetics. That is specifically catering to a mainstream if you want to get them more money. But secondly, even in a world where they aren't having that trade-off, I think that you can still get a lot of financial resources from specifically galvanizing political movements, right? Harar's talked about this a lot, where your art can literally be block text saying, stop killing us, and you are still likely to get a lot of support from communities that actively find that to be valuable in galvanizing their political movements. It's a question as to where you're getting your money. You're definitely not getting as much money from museums, but you are getting money from political movements that want to support the work that you're doing. Secondly, then on aesthetics, right? Because they tell you that, first of all, like, oh, sorry, one second. Yeah, okay, secondly, actually, they tell you that privileged people will discuss things that are not related to them. Like, one, I would just like you to weigh this impact, because truly, like, if we are still getting more politically inaccessible art and getting all of the impacts that Hart gave you in their PM, notably woefully unresponded to by Chris, but our loss is that, like, now sometimes white people talk about BLM, like, very well, fine, if they really want to, like, I guess, okay. But secondly, I think that that actually elides a lot of the value of diversity of thought within art, right? Because yes, it's kind of shitty when white people weigh in on BLM, but a lot of the time people can weigh in more when they're getting more explicitly political, and sometimes the diversity of that thought is actually valuable. Specifically, that is where art is some of the best arenas for that debate to occur. I think they cherry pick examples that we all are somewhat unhappy with, but that diversity of thought is often really valuable in the context of art. Finally, then, what Chris says about aesthetics. He says that currently museums are dominated by Eurocentric and like generally like white forms of art, and they'd like to change that. I think that doesn't change when they literally say, hey, you should should try and get into a museum, therefore like focus on aesthetic value. Because if you're trying to get into a museum, notably the one like clear goal that I got out of opening opposition, that means you are pandering to museums that currently value Eurocentric forms of aestheticism. It is specifically artists saying, fuck that aesthetic value, I care about the political value of my art, I want to represent my community, whether or not it gets me into a museum, that actually changes those aesthetic values. If opposition's mechanism for getting you that kind of representation is kind of like try and like find a middle ground between indigenous art and Eurocentric art so that you can get into these museums and change those aesthetics, I think that's inherently harmful to the representation of your community and to the political impacts that you can access from that motion. Now I'm going to rebuild, but almost kind of restate what Harar said, because hopefully DJ catches it after Chris really dropped a lot of it. But sure, Chris, go.
Yeah, so where are you more likely to get consumers? When you have indigenous art or indigenous art that is seen as liberal?
That is seen as liberal? Oh, literal. I think you're likely to get liberal. Okay, great. I think that a lot of the time, the political art that you're getting is likely to be consumed regardless, right? If you are having the same level of like appeal to your community specifically, it means that it's actually far more accessible if you are being very direct with the kind of political statements that you're making, right? I think a lot of the time, art, as Harar discusses, is specifically seen to belong to a particular community, notably the museum-going communities of North America and the world, right? I think that that often means that people from your own community are likely to not want to consume your weird abstract art that's hanging in the MoMA. They are likely to want to consume the poster that you made that you want to post up around like protests or other things that you're doing, right? I think that means you are likely to get more quote-unquote consumers if your consumers are the people who are experiencing your art and going through the emotions that your art is meant to evoke, and not the people who are paying you big bucks because you're in that museum. Before time, is there a COP line?
Yeah. What made the Van Gogh paintings or the Mona Lisa considered aesthetically pleasing?
I don't know. I don't know what direction that's going in. I think probably like that it appealed to Eurocentric and slash like white people's idea of what was beautiful. I agree that that should be changed, but I think that we give you better mechanisms of that. Notably, we are discussing the trade-offs that artists make when creating their art, and we are saying that artists should always focus on being political and not focus on aesthetic value. If the world around them decides that that is actually really aesthetically beautiful and wants to like treat it like Van Gogh or the Mona Lisa, I think that would be great, but artists should never consider that as a central goal of their art. Finally then, on what Harar brings you in terms of the discomfort and grotesqueness of art, we tell you that a lot of that negative and discomforting reaction is really valuable for galvanizing change. That is both within and outside of your community. Oftentimes people being made to see the atrocities being committed against a particular group are often the people that are most galvanized against them. That is discussed in a number of examples from Harar, and I think that largely it is that kind of art that is likely to get the biggest impacts. At the end of this debate, if literally the only thing we end up hearing about is what the societal impacts are, if we are able to prove to you that grotesque and ugly art galvanizes more people to actively fight for change, I think that we win this debate on that alone. Proud to propose.
I thank that member for their remarks, and I invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close off the top half of today's debate. Hear, hear.
Cool. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, 3, 2, 1, start. The issue with opening government is the last 30 seconds of their speech. When they accept what they have to prove to win this debate, it's not that sometimes when you're given a trade-off, you should pick really grotesque art, but you should always pick it. They then proceed to give you a bunch of arguments on how sometimes grotesque art can be really successful. Look at Chris's speech when he specifically points to you the point when if everyone is making grotesque art, so if all of this trade-off that they say, if literally every artist facing this trade-off chooses to then make grotesque art, you remove the value of the art piece you want to talk about. It literally rebuts all of their arguments. When they say it causes discomfort in you, you don't feel discomfort if that's like a type of art that is significantly more common. If it says it causes you to have an explicit reaction because it's not something you expect, Chris explicitly told you that's not something that happens if you normalize it because many more people are making that trade-off. So before I go on to anything else, let's just look at opening government, look at the burden they set and why by that own standard they lose the debate. So first, what is this debate about? Actually, at the end of the day, we think they've framed the burden right, they've just given the wrong arguments. So yes, it's about a situation where there is a trade-off. You can consider making your art more politically impactful, or you can consider making it aesthetically pleasing. One thing I want to note is this trade-off occurs in far more cases than they want to acknowledge. It is not you are a protest artist, what do you do? It is also you are Taylor Swift, what do you make your next song about? And this was absolutely dropped by their side. And that automatically gives us the win in a large way because their side only has arguments for people who intend on making protest art and then are choosing how much to water it down or not. This is not the majority of people in the debate and not the majority of artists. So Miley Cyrus is well within the scope of the debate, and our argument shows you why you do not want her crowding out Black voices on what impacts Black Lives Matter, no matter how flippant the previous speaker is about the impact of that argument. So the question is, has OG proved to you that you should always focus on it, or that most of the time you should focus on it? I'll be saying something controversial here. Grotesque art is really good, but only when it exists as an outlier and only when it exists as something that judges people and gets their reaction. But not yet, sorry. In many cases, watering down your message is also good. It appeals to a wider scope of people. And yes, there are people who are on the fence who will be voting in elections, who you'd want to listen to your message, who would not read your posters if you make them something that aren't to an extent aesthetically pleasing, so they're going to want to read. On opposition, we're not going to make a value judgment. Different people are affected by different types of these art. We think artists should be trying to make it broadly on the scope of the spectrum because we're not going to claim that one particular type of art is the best for political impact. They did that, but failed to prove that if everyone was making grotesque art, it doesn't just lead to a massive desensitization on the wide scope of it. That was on their case. Now, let's just talk about our case, what we've proved to you in isolation of theirs, and why they had absolutely no response to that. So first, the idea that art now becomes whitewashed, the messages that they care about becomes co-opted by the majority. We get a single response. This is very well fine. It's okay if there are like 3 white people now and there are many more Black Lives Matter activists. Let's be clear. No one is listening to the Black Lives Matter activists who are actually Black on your side anymore because they don't have the funding to capture these resources. They don't have the connections to do it. Chris told you why in the comparative we are better. So when they say diversity of thought is valuable, let's be clear. This is a whitewashed notion of the issues Black people face, the issue that Asian Americans face, and the solutions to them. We actually think it is far better that you hear the voice of the people who are oppressed. Before I go on, opening have a POI.
Okay, DJ, I just think that the fact that opening opposition has refused to engage with our statements that most art is probably socio-political to some extent, and that it does not simply have to be racialized. Like Miley Cyrus making her next video about something distinctly political, not music, because again, that's not aesthetics, would probably be good. Like her last video was literally about her vagina. I think that's great, and I think that's political.
Yeah, the issue is that we've shown you why they're likely why people who are privileged are likely to co-opt the political message of the minority. So yes, it's great that people are talking about issues, but the people who are talking about it are doing it from a whitewashed lens, recommending solutions that are actively harmful because they are not from that life experiences and don't understand what's happening. This notably was there in Chris's speech and had no response to from your speaker. So let's be clear, this protest art they get on their side is much less effective at actually getting the messaging that they want across. But also, a point on desensitization means that are unlikely to actually galvanize any real support in the long term. Lastly, let's talk about what is aesthetically pleasing actually, just resolve this definition quibble, and then deal with why we think that aesthetic art has unique value apart from protest. Before that, CG or POI.
In this debate, you still haven't discharged of telling us how does this affect the artist should they prioritize the political activism in their art? How does that affect them?
Cool. Okay, so I think this point on aesthetic stuff, we'll get to that as well. But on our points on how this affects the artist, Chris had his first point on how this limits the audience to people who you can sell to, therefore significantly reducing your viability of being an artist. And therefore we believe artists, instead of either picking one form of art always or another, should pick somewhere on the scale. Different artists are going to pick different parts on the scale based on their personal preferences and their context. We're saying use the full width of the scale as opposed to a single, always prioritizing the most graphic and the least aesthetically pleasing, because we don't think that's good if everyone starts doing it, even if there are few cases where it can be good. Cool. Now on the value of aesthetics, what is aesthetically pleasing and which side truly changes that? The issue with overall opening government's case is they say, if we give block text, we change the meaning of what is aesthetically pleasing. Unfortunately, there are a large set of cultural norms or cultural art forms that are aesthetically pleasing to that culture, but not aesthetically pleasing to everyone. So for example, a lot of painting strokes and techniques in Indian art is not yet considered aesthetically pleasing to a lot of the Western world, but definitely fits within the definition of aesthetically pleasing because there is a significant community which does find it pleasing, and there is an individual that finds it pleasing. What we would like is for artists maybe not to make any sort of political message at all, but to make mats and tapestries that look wonderful and get people's attention, that changes your definition of beauty. For fashion models to make hairstyles that de-racialize or then make hairstyles that are associated with minorities significantly more accepted and more conceived to be beautiful. These are things that we think you should do. Importantly, there is often a trade-off between them, and we've shown there is unique value to being aesthetic. What have we shown you? It's not that we hate either aesthetic art or protest art that is displeasuring, but we think both should exist, both have unique value, and artists should pick on a scale based on their personal circumstances, and that's what leads to the best outcomes for society and for artists as a whole. Proud to oppose.
Decent.
I thank that member for their remarks, and I invite the member of government to open up the back half of today's debate. Here.
Okay, I need to let you speak.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1, go. The problem with the basic assumption that art is very monolithic is one that we have a problem with. You need to understand that different artists have their own specific niche that they want to portray in today's debate. Firstly, we're going to talk about Nicki Minaj, Cardi B, actually problematizing the idea of body politics and allowing women to fully express themselves in a society that is constantly telling them how to be and how to behave in any case. This is very important, especially in today's debate, because what it does is that firstly, it is able to respond to the idea that art in and of himself is very political and has transcended and moved from a point of just being about the aesthetic, but more about the political impacts that it has in terms of the individuals that consume the art itself. We're talking about artists like Maya Angelou, Viola Davis, where they were able to spark a very significant conversation about dark-skinned women and largely why those individuals ought to be accepted into society. Those political statements are fundamental in today's debate because what they do, firstly, is that they uplift individuals from minority communities, but more than anything, they also do try and portray and problematize and spark a very important conversation about what art ought to be and how individuals can fully express themselves, even in instances where they're able to integrate political values into those specific expressions. This is something that's important and ties into our own extension in today's debate, because we think even though side opening government speaks largely about the value of art, we think this debate is about the most important actor being the artists themselves. So the side closing government, we're going to extend this argumentation. Firstly, we're going to talk about why artists themselves as an individual entity have the obligation, or we think that there's an incentive, a greater incentive for them to make this sort of prioritization, and largely also talk about what this sort of prioritization looks like and how this is something that's beneficial to the artists themselves. The third and the most important thing that we're also going to do in our extension, we're going to justify to you why prioritizing political impact over aesthetic value is something that's important, especially looking at the fact that aesthetic value is very short-term based, but when we look at the political impact, we're looking at the longer period of time where you're able to push that specific conversation, political conversation. That's something that's very important. Before I even get into my extension, I just want to respond to two argumentations that they make here. Firstly, they're going to lose today's debate because their basic assumption is tied on the idea that you aren't able to actually represent individuals in instances where you remove the aesthetic value. We say for shame. We say artists like Beyonce have actually moved from being just about the aesthetic and looking good, because we think that with looking good, there's only a short period of time where you're able to trend in that specific time. Artists like Beyonce have been able and been very important in terms of like pushing the specific dialogue that ought to happen about art, and especially the upliftment of other individuals into society. Why is there something that's important? One, they've shaped the conception that art cannot just be apolitical. Art needs to be political because individuals consume art. Individuals ought to problematize art, especially one that is harmful to their own identity and doesn't allow for a more representation or inclusive of different members of society. This is something that's fundamentally important on the basis that, firstly, we think that it's not monolithic in nature. You're going to have artists that promote body politics. You're going to have artists like Mac Miller that promotes like mental health issues. You're also even going to have artists that promote the politics of Black people. This is something that's very important because it also shows that artists have their own niche, and this is something that we ought to prioritize in today's debate. Most of these argumentations that they have are going to actually be integrated into my positive matter. Let's look at the first fundamental question that we look at aside closing government in today's debate, what this sort of prioritization looks like. We think firstly, we're living in a times where artists also need to be problematized. In instances where we live in a very politically correct context, where we're consistently trying to make sure that artists are not necessarily conveying harmful information or expressions towards the individuals in any society. Why is this something that's very fundamentally important? One, we think that the audience is very fundamental in the art itself, because what it does is that it shapes and influences consumers, individuals who consume the art. This is something that's also very fundamental because we think that the fan base also like it when the artists are able to push robust conversations about politics and able to transcend politics or transcend art in itself as being just a platform of entertainment, but also a platform where they can directly engage with the art form itself and be able to portray those specific informations that we're talking about. First, issues of contentions that we're talking about. We think art for the longest time, like Viola Davis, artists like Viola Davis, who have been pushing this political context for the longest time. This has been very important, especially for their legacy, because we think the narrative of art itself has been able to transcend and been able to show that art is not just about entertainment, but it's also about fighting the struggles that a lot of individuals, especially from minority communities, are able to face. This is something that's very significant because we think that Beyonce are actually portraying art as king and able to understand or able to express the lived experiences of like Black individuals. This is something that has been very uplifting to those specific individuals, and this is largely why they embrace the art itself. We say for shame from opening opposition from simply saying that when you don't value a static value, it simply means that they lose out on money. We say that Beyonce is still alive and still making a lot of money on the basis that she's pushing the political impact of art and not necessarily saying that art is about the aesthetic value. We think art has transcended from that specific idea. Before I continue, I'm going to take opening opposition.
So far, there is no trade-off that stops Cardi B from existing on our side, and there's no analysis as to why Cardi B doesn't just become normalized and the message is less powerful. But if art is framed as political rather than aesthetic, what is considered aesthetic never changes.
Okay, so even if this debate is about the trade-off and that we're willing to accept in today's debate, we think what Cardi B has also been able to do is that it's not just about the aesthetic value. You cannot lie about that. What she has been very important to do is about expressing the body politics and trying to show that women can feel comfortable in their own femininity without necessarily being told by society how to be or how to react in any particular society. This is something that's fundamentally important because one, it simply shows you that artists are not just prioritizing aesthetic value, because for the longest time, they are now trying to conceptualize the fact that aesthetic value is not it. Because with political impact, it means that you are able to ensure that in the long run, you're able to spark those important conversations that happen within the society itself. We think closing government is able to do what they're able to do is that firstly, we think that there's an incentive for artists as an independent entity, especially because what this debate is about, to push for politics. And the instances that when they push for politics, one, they're able to garner as much individuals in terms of trying to consume their art as possible, but also secondly, it's also a way of trying to make sure that art represent a large majority of individuals. But even if it's not just the majority, even the minority of those individuals, because we think that we ought to understand that art is not monolithic in its nature. The other thing is that we're not necessarily harming any political discourse whatsoever. What we're simply doing, we're progressing the political discourse that happens, because it means that we're not just trying to allow for individuals to conceptualize that political discourse in a very monolithic way of art being one of very entertaining, but we're trying to ensure that individuals are able to consume art, feel entertained, but at the same time allow for artists to push that political impact. Closing government proves to you two things in our extension. Firstly, we prove to you that artists as individuals, entities, have a moral obligation to actually do this because of the kinds of incentives that it has in terms of being very activist and trying to make sure that individuals are able to consume the art. Second thing that we're also able to do, we're also trying to show you that the political impacts of art are far more better as opposed to a static value. With all those words, I've never been proud to propose.
I thank that member for their speech, and I invite the member of opposition to open up closing opposition. Hear, hear.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Awesome, thanks. Grab the timer. Cool. I'm gonna start in 3, 2, 1. So the first thing I'm going to do is frame OG out. So take note that a lot of the case builds that they have better political impacts, but don't explain that the sole and better purpose of art is to be able to serve and uniquely be able to provide a lot of these political impacts. I think the question is not where do we best galvanize movements, where do we best bring people together to be able to serve a political purpose, but what is the inherent societal value that art should have. But secondly and conversely, I think OO doesn't really take the trade-off as a result of, I guess, being able to follow world's rules, of being able to prioritize one over the other. I will concede to opening government, they are likely to be able to provide these political impacts to a greater extent. The question is whether or not these are positive and whether or not this is the greater purpose that art should serve. So it's the two questions I want to answer in this debate now. Number one, what purpose should art serve? But number two, what's better for increasing the inclusivity within the art institution, which I think answers the questions from both opening and closing government then. So firstly, what purpose should art serve? And the first thing I want to do is respond and frame out that it should serve a political purpose. The first thing I want to say is that there are a significant number of alternatives to do a lot of the things that government wants to be able to do. The media, news outlets, actual protests, being able to have people who are probably actually far more knowledgeable and specialized and expert in a lot of these complex political issues to be able to discuss them uniquely. Take note, not only does this change the priority on our side, but a lot of the art that they present also uniquely takes away from the limited media attention and resources that are far more likely to be targeted and better solved. But secondly, this also means that this is an additional mechanism in a sea of possible alternatives. So a lot of their benefits are not they get galvanization and we don't, but that there is a small and marginal method of galvanization that I don't think is particularly good. Even if they POI it, I don't think they're able to build it. Actually, take a POI now. OG?
So, okay, I think that there's a fundamental misunderstanding in number one, why artists first create art. Most artists do create art to have some political, sociological purpose, but even if you don't buy that on face, I just think that it's not true that you get more attention for political purposes through the media, which is often inaccessible to people from these communities. Media can focus on art, and that can in turn bring attention to these purposes. And why do they have to work against one another as opposed to in tandem?
Okay, number one, then I think a lot of the methods of you spreading out your art through the media are just equally ineffective as a result of that POI. But number two, if the purpose of artists is to be able to have a political, I don't think that you're able, we could change that through the motion and opposition. So I don't think that is uniquely available for them then. Secondly is that the government assumption is that it is always used for good, when a lot of the art that they want to be able to serve a political purpose could be used against movements, could be used in divisive and dangerous ways. Moreover, I would say the exclusivity because of the elitist nature of the art institution is far more likely to be able to garner it in this way. In the Philippines, the way that people portrayed poor individuals was dangerous because it romanticized their struggle rather than being able to represent them because it came from rich people, explaining to us what poor people were like. So, why then should art be aesthetically pleasing? I would say that given the harsh and incredibly pressing nature of reality, the unique purpose of art is to be able to give us an escape. And I think the first characterization of that is that art is the only way for us to radically re-envision what society ought be, or alternative worlds in which we could have possibly lived. And I don't think it's any possible in any other possible alternative that they have. But number two, it's that the aesthetic nature of art is what uniquely pulls us because it speaks to the primal and inherent nature of us as human beings. It's great that OG can't explain why they love the Mona Lisa so much as asked in the POI, precisely because it speaks to an innate human response rather than one that talks about the complex and intellectual nature of art then. I have a few impacts to be able to explain why this is better. Firstly, I think uniquely serves art as a purpose of comfort, which is why we have art therapy, which is why it's the ability for you to connect to a song simply because you enjoy the beat, the ability to connect to a film simply because you like the cinematography to which it speaks. I would say then that this is uniquely available in art that is not allowable in many other mediums and institutions. But secondly, I'd say art is uniquely unifying in this regard then, because it speaks to a shared human and cultural experience. OG doesn't tell you that art that disturbs precisely makes you look away. And I think then that is the unique way in which people are likely to pull out and withdraw from a lot of the experiences in art, when we can instead use them as to be able to describe shared human experiences that may be apolitical but important to be able to represent. And I'll take note, even if minority individuals, there's a lot of criticism of the Oscars right now that they push film towards things like being able to present the Black experience as one of slavery through 12 Years a Slave, as one of drug abuse and ghettoization as a result of TV shows like The Wire, rather than speaking to what are shared human experiences that Black individuals also feel, like coming of age film, like having an ordinary love story that they are so against. And I would say is also good in being able to escape all the harsh realities that are presented by years of structural oppression, that uniquely people might only be able to escape through this one medium and be comforted because of the harsh and pressing nature of the world already exists today. So what this proves is this is a unique method of comfort for individuals that is not accessible, as opposed to a lot of the political alternatives that they present, which could be harmfully used, and moreover is possible in so many other ways. Secondly, why is better for the art institution? Take note, a lot of the, if all artists shifted to being able to use this in only political methods, number one, I'd say that's harder because it makes art far more complex. And I would say the more understandable art is one that is more likely to speak to everyone, i.e. what majority individuals are likely to represent the political issues to be able to be, because they already have control of the media, because they already have control of other methods of being able to portray what political topics should be discussed. But secondly is that it could even be viewed as offensive, because in the instance that minority individuals try to advance their own career within the art institution, they are seen as blaming the people who are probably going to be dependent on approving their artwork, probably dependent on them being able to support their streams, be able to view their films, etc., that make it so difficult. Why is it then better to be able to have a more representative art institution on our side, or why is it more possible? I would say even if you have a Eurocentric, and that's the absolute worst case on our side, conception of what aesthetic ought to be, it is the democratizing nature of information, which allows you to inform yourself about different art movements, which allows you to train yourself in specific styles and natures of art that I think are far easier for a minority individual to be able to connect to and be able to make beautiful art, rather than one that is inherently part of their identity and they want to speak about, but is constantly shut out by an elitist art institution. So what's important here is to note that, number one, we have a lot more people who are formerly disenfranchised by this institution, who are more likely to see careers and be able to express themselves through this unique method of art. But two, the ability to see the minority individual as an artist, as being able to represent themselves, is less possible on their side in the instance that it is viewed to be offensive, divisive, and dangerous speech that is more likely to be bad, and therefore a lot of the people in power will not accept it. I'm incredibly proud to oppose and debate at 5:30 a.m.
I thank that member for their speech, and I invite the Gov Whip to close off the Gov half of today's debate. Hear, hear.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I'm not going to turn my camera on because of that glitch, yeah? Yeah, okay, I'll start speaking in 3, 2, 1, go. Part of the biggest problem with opening opposition and closing opposition by the speech that we just received right now is that they do not show an inherent harm to artists in themselves when we prioritize or when they opt to prioritize political impact over aesthetic value. We think that in anything, they also ignore my member's speech when she tells you that a political disc or activism or political activism around political issues is not one that monolith. What this means is that not every artist, for example, not every artist is going to speak about feminism, not every artist is going to speak about all of those struggles that exist in society. We think it's disingenuous, if anything, for CO to not even engage the exclusive nuance analysis about how Cardi B is one artist that speaks about feministic issues, firstly. But secondly, we have artists who, for example, do not exist within the minority when we speak about Mac Miller, who then chose to activize for mental health through his own art. We think that the nuance in there shows that it's more impactful for the artist, but also removes OO's analysis around hampering representation and how it whitewashes of struggle. We think that if anything, they can't even cite one example of an artist who has been white or whose the political impact impact has been whitewashed or whose representation has been removed, right? A few issues of responses. Let's start with opening opposition. We think that they speak about three things that actually advance in the debate. And I'll show you that then it removes their aim, it goes against their main aim. They say they support a balance, right? And they say, and then the analysis that they run in the debate is, first, we're going to hammer representation because artists are going to become restricted to politics. It's going to limit the audience, and therefore they're going to be poor because they're going to look finances. We think that not to those conclusions, because we don't tell you how artists become poor by then pushing a political agenda or political change within their art. We think it's unfair for them to say that artists are going to then become poor in that instance. But secondly, they say now artists are going to be restricted to politics. We say that's a pure lie. We say that Beyonce exists is not exclusively restricted to politics, but the inverse, which is particularly important, and one thing they didn't want to engage in Atlant's speech is that then it allows for political correctness. And that Beyonce, for example, in Lemonade speaks about feminism and the issues of cheating from niggas who are messed up. And then she moves then to speak about the identities of politics, to speak about the identities of Black Lives Matter. We think it's not true, then that it limits or restricts their range of politics. If anything, it increases it and makes it better, right? Then the second idea that they speak about is that there's inherent value to aestheticism, right? The only analysis that they give of the value is that artists are able to opt in and push for that, right? We respond to that exclusively to say also aesthetic value, aestheticism is about trending now, right? We think that you're going to get your numbers and you're going to be talked about for a week, but vis-a-vis prioritization of political impact is something that creates, number one, legacy. Atlan speaks about this around Viola Davis and Maya Angelou. But secondly, you are able to facilitate and push conversations beyond the art, right? So when we speak about Black is King from Beyonce, we speak about representation of Black people within the world. When you speak about, for example, or listen to Mac Miller when he speaks about mental health, we understand that mental health is a thing that happens across races. If anything, range exists in all instances. We think that opposition can't tell us the inherent value of aestheticism without telling us the inherent non-value in political impact, right? The nuance that comes from CG is that we show you that why should artists, they themselves, opt into this process and into prioritizing political impact and why it is beneficial to them and their industry, right? Here we analyze, in addition to creating political correctness, is that we progress political discourse among spaces that generally never were spoken about those particular instances, right? This is particularly then important because this is why always artists try to become a politically correct lest they get cancelled on social media on those instances that exist, right? So if then we're going to run with opening opposition's analysis of supporting a balance, we tell you that the hampering of representation happens in their world, the lose of whitewashing of political struggles happens in their world, because now Miley Cyrus has to choose a politic but still be aesthetic because everyone else is doing it, as opposed to Miley Cyrus, because that's the political identity of herself, therefore extends the political identity of the audience that follows her, right? The objective thing that also completely takes out is that artists, they themselves have audiences, right? So the artists want to speak about or speak about feminism. This is particularly important for you to note that they would then have the option to opt into a political struggle or advising for a struggle that best fits their brand. This is particularly important because we need to then protect the artists themselves, because we don't want artists to speak about anything and anything that way or that is politic. And therefore, establishing a balance from opening opposition can't work as an aim, because this then yields to that question that they want to run out, right? I'll take closing up.
All your benefits are contingent on a liberal artist fighting for minority rights. When the vast majority of the art world is dominated by conservative people who spew out conservative artworks, how do your benefits then materialize in that context?
Again, this is the issue that we've been trying to call out at CG, that artists don't have to speak on everything. Sure, the majority of audience doesn't like the conversation of Black Lives Matter. It doesn't mean that the hundreds of millions of Beyonce's followers don't care about that conversation. Similarly to she doesn't have to speak about Black Lives Matter, but she opts to speak about politics. It doesn't make the conversation non-important, which then removes your entire analysis actually as CEO of what is the purpose or what the purpose of art should serve. How you argue this analysis is that you explain that media is one that is controlled by dominant majority, which is true. However, remember that media is a tool that is used to disseminate art and what art therefore you can't run an analysis. The second idea that they speak about is why should aesthetically pleasing. Note that CO doesn't do any analysis, the same point that OO ran around the inherent value of aestheticism, right? The only analysis they have is that artists need to opt in and do it, right? Vis-a-vis the much analysis that we get from OG and our CGN extension and showing that it has political impact to themselves and to their artistry of work, right? We think that that is particularly important. At the end of the day, we need to ask yourselves, which house is then in the best interest of artists? Which house is in the best interest of artists progressing beyond and transcending into the political realm and prioritizing impact? We tell you that is the government bench in today's debate, right? Secondly, we tell you that because aestheticism has only short-term lived values, such as trending, such as staying, being spoken about for a week, we think that that's something that we will decline in today's debate, right? Secondly, we think that we even give you examples of artists who even prioritized their political impact and did not lose their relevance in the debate. Maya Angelou, Viola Davis, Beyonce, Mac Miller, all of those who speak about different issues that affect individuals. We think that we're in the best interest of artists. Profoundly proud to propose.
I thank that member for their speech, and I invite the opposition whip to close out today's debate.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So I think the main issue in this round is what we ought to prioritize, given that is explicitly what the motion is asking for anyway. And I think it is closing opposition that gave you the three mechanisms to weigh this debate. The first being that there are other mechanisms to get the outcomes that government wants. At no point do they really explain the exclusive value of art, aside from maybe the assertion that says that art is able to stir the population or get people interested. But note that this argument or this assertion is contingent on the current context of the art world, which a lot of times highly prioritizes aesthetics. The reasons why people talk about particular artworks because they literally draw your attention. In a world where the art prioritizes a lot of the political impact, they don't really explain to us how that becomes different from the other forms of media that exist and therefore able to uniquely get a galvanization. The second point of weighing we provided to you is that political art is not a universal good in a way that aesthetics is, and at no point did closing government respond to this point. But lastly, we engage the assertions coming from opening government about the purpose of art, and I'll weigh that throughout this issue, and I'll explain the other fringe issues that you in today's debate. Firstly, on whether or not there are other mechanisms to get the artwork. We said there's things like the media, there's things like protests, which are more likely to be political, and it is unclear what artworks are important. What we want to do now is weigh this against the mechanism Gov provided. They said that political art is more likely to be successful from OG, one, because art under their side is grotesque, and grotesque art gets change. Notably, I think the way opening opposition responds to this is just to misrepresent it by pushing it to the extreme, by saying that you have to defend a world where every art is grotesque. I don't think that that's opening government was fighting for. I think opening government reasonably suggests that there's some art in the prioritization that becomes grotesque, and that's why they're able to get change. I think the response I'll provide at open opposition whip is that a lot of times art that is grotesque does not get the change for the very reason that it is grotesque, because people are turned off by how gross it is, or B, because people think it is exaggerated and unreal because they don't say it is impossible that people are that poor, or it's impossible that people are that suffering, and therefore it's just the imaginations of the artist. Note inherently about art is that there is a free realm for creation. You can exaggerate things with your own imagination, and that's why it's unclear whether it gets changed under their side. Secondly, my partner pointed out why there are a lot of moral implications about grotesque art, why a lot of times it's actually criticized by the African American community, why it's criticized by the Filipino community, because it misrepresents them and reduces them to only people who are suffering, but does not reduce them to everything else. Please just type your POIs there in the chat. Secondly, then, we would suggest that they say art is clear under their side. At no point do they really prove the extent to which this is clear, because even if I believe that to a degree it's clearer than aesthetic art, even if that's true, it's unclear why people will necessarily get the message behind the symbolisms of different artworks. Notably, Gov does not just have to prove that they're successful at more likely to get change than aesthetic art. they have to prove to the comparative that closing opposition provided, which is that you take away space from things like the media, from other forms of social political organization. And notably, we would suggest that using all these standards that Govs uses, they're far more likely to be clear, they're far more likely to be realistic to the reality that people are facing, and lastly, they're far less likely to be privileged for the reason that a lot of times, because people see art as not a necessity, a lot of the minority groups who are struggling economically don't really prioritize that, and therefore are not likely to prioritize that in comparison to things like the media, which just seem to be an essential in the day-to-day life, and therefore they're less likely to do things like fund the arts, and therefore art institutions are likely to be representative of the elite in society, so it's unclear whether or not the change will be good under their side of the house. But the last thing I want to point out is that all of their claim about benefits are contingent on one, artists being on the liberal spectrum of society, when a lot of the artists are conservative. Note how many American war propaganda films are produced by Hollywood to justify a lot of the militarization in the Middle East, to justify a lot of the problems. It is unclear whether or not this gets changed under their side, or B, even if you have good intentions, what my partner pointed out, is a lot of the artwork which over-gratifies the suffering was also potentially offensive to artists. Like grotesque images of things like rape, for example, might turn off or trigger a lot of the harms of potential victims. The important thing to note here is, I agree, there are some good artworks that fight for good things, but there are also bad artworks that fight for bad things. In a world where you prioritize that, it at best cancels out the potential value you get from the politicization, and therefore it is unclear whether it is good. It can potentially be harmful to individuals. What is the comparison with aestheticism? Notably, aesthetics is far more universal because people, for as long as they have innate beliefs that something is beautiful, can relate to it, regardless of the cultural context that you have. Notably, there are a lot of people from Asian and developing countries who like Western standards of aesthetics, regardless of whether or not it is Western, because it innately represents their particular own interests, and therefore it is far more likely to be universal. But even if we believe the characterization of the opening half, that some people have aesthetic preferences that are differing per culture, the unique benefit that you get from CO is that if something is aesthetically pleasing to someone, it does not necessarily harm another individual. So I might not particularly like rap music, for example, but it doesn't mean that because rap music exists, it harms me. The comparison of political art is that it's inherently rivalrous. That is to say, political art that exists harms my own interests, sometimes offends me, and therefore it is not clear whether or not it is a universal good. Before I move on, opening government.
Yeah, so you've already conceded that we get better political art on our side. What value then do you access from widespread representation of minority art if all of that art has been defanged of any political critique and you aren't getting the art that you would normally have at protests, at that kind of community organizing otherwise?
So I guess this debate asks us to defend going against political art. So inherently that is our trade-off. What we're saying is the value of political representation might be good in a vacuum, but when you weigh it against one, the fact that art does not really create much change in society, given there are countering factors, but B, because a lot of times the political art that you have counteracts other political art, means that it's unclear why that's more important than the aesthetic value. Even if you believe that in a vacuum, and like being able to feel good is not that important, the fact that it is the only source for you to feel good, the only source for you to get that therapy, the only source for beauty, because it's art inherently, it's able to create things out of fiction, and it allows you to be able to get some degree of benefit that is important in today's debate. That is the weighing mechanism that was not engaged by any speaker under their side of the house. But lastly, they assert that the purpose of art is politicization. Notably, this is an incredibly asserted premise with no reason. We can just counter to say that artists create art not because of like politics, but because of aesthetics. It's unclear which one is likely to be true. But the last thing they then say is it harms artists. We win this point because I don't care about what the artists feel like, for the reason that this is a third-party neutral observer debate. This is not an actor debate. Secondly, because the vast majority of people are consumers, not artists. Thirdly, because the vast majority of underprivileged individuals are probably not artists too, because they can't afford the art degree or have the like financial cushion to allow them to participate in art otherwise done. So even if you believe that from closing government that artists are harmed under their side, they're just significantly less important than the general benefit you provide to society, which we were able to weigh. For all those reasons, please vote closing opposition. Thank you.